supplies with a rebound in agriculture production globally. And with this direction in prices in mind, I'm sure pulses market is certainly going to follow this directional change if it were to happen. And it'll certainly follow the general trend in agriculture markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. There is an announcement now before we...
Thank you, sir. With the permission of the chair, I have yet another pleasant duty to do, and that is, of course, thank our speakers for their valuable time and expertise. May I request our Honorable Chair to do us the honors. Our Chief Guest, Mr. Rajiv Agarwal, Secretary, Government of India, is going to do us the honors on this one. First off, of course, to our friend from abroad, Mr. Brian Clancy of Stat Publishing. We have a memento. Thank you, sir, for your presence, and we do hope you take away a good view of India and a memento to make this occasion special. My friends will be getting the memento from backstage. To Mr. Muhammad Wala. From Mozambique. Thank you, sir. And I do hope you have time to enjoy the beauty of Mumbai and India as much as you can. Mozambique is a wonderful country. I've been speaking to Mr. Wala, and he tells me that besides agriculture, it's an agrarian country, beautiful people. And most importantly, you know, if they fit any place in Europe, they speak Portuguese very frequently. I think Portuguese is the official language. So lots of interesting facets about countries, especially in that part of the world. And as Mr. Patel had said yesterday, that we're looking forward to Africa being the food bowl of the world. Fantastic, sir. Thank you, Mr. Wala. And last but not the least, the gentleman who's always been a strong support to forums, especially like this, a wealth of information, the editor of the Hindu Business Line, Mr. G. Chandrasekhar. Thank you, sir, once again for being here. If you were here at the inauguration yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, it was the mellifluous voice of Mr. G. Chandrasekhar's wife who did the invocation to the Almighty, bring blessings on this Global Conclave 2012. So we need to doubly thank Mr. Chandrasekhar and his family. Backstage is a little bit like negotiating Bombay's roads. There's so many, it's like a maze. So you must excuse the ladies as they take a little bit of time as they come up. From amaze to amazing. Thank you, Mr. Clancy. Thank you, Mr. Wala. Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Ladies and gentlemen, as we've already announced, we shall continue, and we request Mr. Rajiv Agarwal to remain seated on the dais as we continue, and request the other speakers to please step forward to take their places on the dais. I'd like to request Mr. Jeff Von Pevnage, who's Vice President General Manager for Columbia Grains, to please grace the dais. Mr. Gordon Bacon, CEO of Pulse Canada. Mr. Mies van Dongen of Mies Agro, and Rob Braley from Pentagny Dairy to please grace the dais. As already announced, we do not have an official tea break. There'll be running tea and coffee all through the day. If you require tea and coffee to be served at your tables, the gentlemen of the hotel will be glad to serve you. Just put your hand up, they'll come around, ask you for your choice, and they'll serve you in a few minutes. We now move on to the part about origin presentations. We are going to have presentations of origin from USA. While I introduce the presentation, some presentations, if they need to be loaded, can be done right now at the technical desk right here. We have presentations from USA, from Canada, from Russia, France, Ukraine, and Australia. Speaking to us about origins in Australia would be Rob Braley from Pentagny Dairy. Taking care of Russia, France, Ukraine, Mies van Dongen of Mies Agro Consulting. Canada, Mr. Gordon Bacon of Pulse Canada. And from USA, it's going to be Mrs. Jeff Juan Pevenage from Columbia Grains. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to hand you back to your chairman, Mr. Rajiv Agarwal.
Thank you. Now there will be presentation, origin presentation from USA, Mr. Jeff Van Pevenage. I hope it is pronounced is correct. Please.
It's not here, so do you have a copy with you? I sent my copy to them. To them? Okay. So what we do is we request, when we get that organized, we request Mr. Gordon Bacon to continue. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is some technical problem in presentation. So we'll request origin presentation from Canada, Mr. Gordon Bacon.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to be part of this presentation. It's certainly an honor to be invited to the inaugural Global Pulses Conclave, and I would like to thank the organizers. And Mr. Rajiv Agarwal, I certainly also want to say thank you to Government of India for the promotion work that the government is doing to promote consumption of yellow peas. Certainly, as a Canadian supplier, we appreciate those efforts, as do the other suppliers of yellow peas around the world. So what I would like to do in my presentation is just give you a few of the issues which are relevant to Canadian pulse production. And as Mr. Brian Clancy has said, some of the material is going to be the same. I would like to start by saying that Pulse Canada does not do market forecasting. In fact, we subscribe to Stat Publishing and Brian Clancy's company to get information. What I'm going to do in my presentation is give Government of Canada, Statistics Canada numbers, and I think there are some small variations between what the Government of Canada is looking at in terms of a forecast and what Brian Clancy's numbers are. And I think it's an interesting comparison to take a look at the market from two different perspectives. This is a picture of what Canada looks like right now. This is our winter season. As Brian has already pointed out, though, it's a bit of an unusual winter in that it has been warm and we have had very little snow. In some areas of Canada, that we've had less than 20% of normal winter precipitation, which comes as snow. And as many of you know, our planting season doesn't begin until April and May, and our harvest begins in August and runs September into October. So from India's perspective, we only have one crop a year. The winter crop you see is fields covered with snow. In Canada, like many other farming regions, the weather is always very important, and our production, and Mr. Chandrasekhar spoke about it in his presentation, is really weather determined. And what I want to show in the next two slides is that we've had very unusual weather. Our weather patterns are not very predictable. If you take a look at the weather we've had in the spring of 2011, it was very wet, and as one of the reasons why our planted area of many crops was reduced was simply because farmers could not get into the field. This slide is taking a look at moisture levels for a 12-month period, and you see that, in fact, the colors are indicating we've had average precipitation, because we started out very wet in the beginning of 2011, but then it turned very dry. So on average, you can say moisture conditions were fairly normal. This slide is just reinforcing what Brian Clancy mentioned, and that is that for the last 6 months, primarily through the winter, late fall of last year and winter into 2012, conditions have been very dry. And the red color is indicating, and through most of the map you'll see that we're under 60% of what would be normal weather or normal precipitation. This doesn't mean an awful lot right now because we don't have a crop growing. I just wanted to show the slides to say that the weather conditions have been very erratic and unusual, and that's really one of the keys that you'll want to watch when you're looking at Canadian production potential. In this slide, we're looking at the area or the production of various crops in Canada, and you can see that by far and away the largest crops that Canadian farmers are growing are cereal crops, followed by canola. And the three lines at the bottom of the graph are showing where peas, lentils, and flax fit on the picture. So when we talk about the returns that farmers get from different crops, this is going to influence to some extent which crops they're growing. So you see that canola production has been increasing over the last number of years. It's because canola returns have been very good. So the challenge that we have in the pulse industry is to make sure that the returns are high enough so that farmers in Canada are encouraged to grow peas and are encouraged to grow lentils, because they do have cropping options, and our job is to make sure that we are driving as many of the costs out of the system and many of the uncertainties out of the system as we can, so that the return back to the Canadian farmer is as high as is possible. This information is similar to what Brian put forward in his presentation. After a few years of declining area ceded to peas in Canada, we're now looking to see an increase in production in 2012. Again, this is consistent with what Brian Clancy had noted in his presentation. So looking at an increase in seeded area, again, these are Stats Canada numbers, of about 27%, which would increase production of peas by about 25%. And I should also point out that it's still very early. Farmers really don't have to finalize their planting decisions until April or May. So very early in the season to be predicting what production is going to be in terms of seeded area, let alone knowing what the total volume might be. There's an awful lot of numbers on this supply and disposition table, but I've circled a few key ones. And as you see, we're looking at a 27% forecasted increase in production. But the carry-in stocks were something that Brian mentioned and I wanted to point out as well. And that is that the forecast is for low carry-in numbers. So even though we're seeing a big increase in seeded area, because the stocks have been drawn down, that total supply, which is the number I've circled on the lowest line, the total supply of peas that's available is in fact still relatively low and quite a bit lower than we saw in the 2008, 2009, and 2010 period. So the increase in area is half the story, but with much lower stocks on farms, the total available supply is relatively unchanged. And again, this is just looking at the demand side, and the key part that I've highlighted in blue, you see that even with that increase in area, the exportable supply is not going to be significantly different and is down from where it was just a few years ago. I think it's interesting, clearly India is our biggest market. It's a growing market. We have already seen record exports to India. You also see in this graph where China has grown as a destination for Canadian yellow peas. And I think this was noted last night in the opening remarks that it is of some concern and certainly of interest in India to see what China is doing in the market. And you can see these are our top 5 export destinations, and these 5 markets represent about 89% of Canadian yellow pea exports. So clearly the markets to watch in addition to India are into China. And it's interesting also to see in China what yellow peas are being used for, and primarily extracting the starch to make a type of noodle. I'll touch briefly on lentils. Brian has mentioned this as well. With high carryout stocks and with the price signals that farmers are getting, the forecast is that we will see a decline in seeded area of lentils in 2012. Of course, with a decline in seeded area, we're also going to see a decline in production. So you can, if we're taking a look at our export destinations for lentils, it's also interesting to note how our lentil exports to India have declined in recent years. perhaps in part due to the price of other pulses relative to lentils and also related to some of the recent quality issues that we've had in Canada in the 2010 year in particular. So I went through this fairly quickly, in part because Brian Clancy had covered a lot of the information, but I just wanted to make a couple of concluding comments, and one of them is a promotion to attend the Canadian Convention in June in Montreal. Of course, the crop will have been planted, will have been in the ground for a couple of months, so in June we'll know better what the seeded area will be, and we will have gone through May and June's weather, which is really critical to the overall production of pulses. Weather is always important, but frankly, it's too early to make any prediction about whether we are in a dry period or a wet period because everything can change very quickly. Really, the key months to be looking for weather in Canada are May, June, and July. And finally, my comment and concluding remark would be that seeding intentions can change, and so farmers in Canada will be looking at the relative return from wheat, and as many of you know, we're having some fundamental change in our wheat marketing system in Canada, which is leaving many questions out there in farmers' minds in terms of whether it's an opportunity to plant more wheat. And while many farmers keep a rotation of pulses, oilseeds, and cereals, they do have some flexibility to move these areas around. Now, I think a copy of my presentation is likely to be on the website for the Global Pulses Conclave. So I've noted a couple of websites that you can follow. One of them is the supply and disposition information, which is updated by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada every couple of weeks. And the second site is looking at the soil moisture maps, which again are updated on a regular basis. So I will conclude my remarks and my presentation by again encouraging all of you to come to Montreal to the Canadian Convention, and